Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation with Farha Ternikar on intersections of food with gender and religion among Muslim immigrants, particularly in the US. I'm very happy to welcome our esteemed speaker today. She is Farha Ternikar, and she's the Director of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at Moyne College, Syracuse, New York. Her current manuscript, Faith and Food Networks, Muslim Women's Acts of Resistance and Resilience in the American Diaspora, examines how, in addition to race and gender, global Islamophobia continues to play an important role in how we can understand the role of food for Muslim South Asian American women. She teaches courses in feminist theory and race, gender, and pop culture. She is the author of Intersectionality and the Muslim South Asian Middle Class Between Hijab and Halal, and several articles including Hijab and the Abrahamic Traditions. She currently serves on the advisory board of the ASFS, Association for the Study of Food in Society. She was most recently featured on the Classical Ideas podcast, where you can learn more about her scholarship and activism. Farah, it's an honor to have you on Doing Sociology. Thank you so much for joining and welcome to this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here and connect with scholars in India that are doing such great and innovative work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, let me begin by asking you this question about what role food plays in maintaining this collective ethnic identity amongst Desi communities in the US, particularly in this context of how we are looking at immigration.
Sure. So when I think about food, I started, thinking about it as like more like a sociologist in terms of the function that food has in society, right? So for Desi specifically, my book that came out in 2021 was based on interviews of second generation Muslim Indians and Pakistani Americans. And what I found when I was doing that work is that it really helps create community, right, in the diaspora through at least three ways, if not more, right? Through regional cuisine, right? Because you all being Indian sociologists, you know that there's really no such thing as Indian food, right? It's like Hyderabadi food, Gujarati food, right? I think when we're in India, we can refer to these things even more specifically by region, but also helps maintain recipes, right? Because now we see in the United States, we have second generation and third generation Desi immigrants. And then thirdly, I would say it helps create community food even through our shopping habits, right? Through our Desi grocery stores, through our restaurants, right? Those become community centers. So I would say food plays a role in maintaining collective ethnic identity, at least in those three ways. But I also want to say that this is also gets complicated because when we think about generation, when we think about the differences in region, when we think about class, right? I think that all can help, add even more diversity in terms of how we think about that. But I think those are three common themes, right? Thinking about regional cuisine, thinking about recipes, and thinking about desi grocery stores and restaurants, even if we're talking about like a samosa shop or a chai shop, like as a site of community.
Right. Right. Thank you. That's very interesting, and that brings us to our next question, which is on what would you say is culinary consumption in this sense, right?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Sure. When I think about culinary consumption, I think of it as the concept that refers to what we purchase, create, or eat when it comes to food culture, right? So even like what we buy, right? So like for those Muslims, Desis, Muslim South Asians that do maintain halal, right? And not all of them do, right? It's what they purchase and where they purchase it. If they are buying halal chicken or halal goat, for what they're cooking. It's also refers to the concept of what we create, right? So, what we're making, are we making our biryani or khichdi from scratch? Are we using pre-made masala mixes, which have been very common since like the 1980s and 1990s, even in the global north? And then also, what do we eat, right? How does what we eat define us in terms of what we consume, right? So if we do avoid pork or we avoid meat or we avoid certain kinds of spices, some of that, of course, is because of religion, but some of that's also because of the region, right? Where even here in the US, like what region did you, as Indian and Pakistani immigrants, did we immigrate from? If it's from the north or the south, if it's from Gujarat or Hyderabad or Punjab, all of those things I think shape consumption. And I think that has changed not just by generation, but just like historically, because in the 1970s and 1980s, in some parts of the United States, it wasn't so easy to find things like spices, like garam masala, or, even like halal meat, and so by the 1990s and 80s, especially in bigger cities like Chicago, New York, you had, multiple grocery stores, Patel Brothers stores in Chicago and New York City, and then of course halal markets as well. And then as the population increases, then you even see these distinctions, right? All the restaurants were first called Indian restaurants, and then you start to see, oh, these are the Pakistani restaurants, these are the Bangladeshi restaurants. That's not just an Indian restaurant, it's a North Indian restaurant. And so I would say all of those things are part of culinary consumption when we think about what do we consume, create, purchase, and eat, and how does that say something about who we are as a society or as an immigrant culture.
Right. And then, Farah, that brings us to the question of women, right? So, how do they see women construct sort of an authentic cultural marker through
Yes,
food in a
yes.
host nation?
Yes. So first of all, as a sociologist, I always like to emphasize that authenticity is a social construction, right? So this idea of authentic food in the American diaspora, I think we need to complicate it in terms of like what is authenticity and how does like authenticity even when we construct that, how does that change? Like, so I like to use like the example of biryani and what is authentic biryani, right? But that idea can shift depending on time, geography, and access to resources. So, what is authentic? Does it mean creating your grandmother's recipes or your mother's recipes, right? So, I think that's a complicated concept, but Desi women in my research do play an important role, right? In terms of using food as a cultural marker through the recipes they pass on, as I mentioned, but also in terms of how they serve food, even, right? Like the idea of like everything from like how is food served to, what ingredients do they use? And then, of course, lastly, I would say the preparation, right? And so when we think about I like to use, as I said, I like to use biryani as an example because when we ask somebody, is your biryani authentic? One of the first things that we talk about in the American diaspora is, are you making it? Are you making everything homemade, right? Is the biryani masala actually from scratch, right? Because since the 1980s, the pre-packaged masalas, like especially Shan Masala Company, like they make a lot of the biryani masalas that are commonly sold in the Indian and Pakistani grocery stores here. So one of the questions often is that authentic if you're using a pre-packaged masala? I argue, yes, it is, because these practices have actually been passed down from our mothers. And so if they were using prepackaged masalas, they're not always making everything from scratch. We kind of have to question, what do we mean by authenticity, right? Because there's these shortcuts that even in India, upper class and middle class women are using, right? Not everything is always from scratch. And so I say that, maintaining authentic foodways, that role that women has, it is really, I would say it's a really combination of trying to preserve and pass on recipes from their mothers here that are often were not, often were recipes that they learned here in the US, not necessarily their grandmother's recipes, which would have been recipes from India or Pakistan, right? So I think, the ways that they are maintained is through trying to follow their mother's recipes, but then also sometimes, we see that there are hybrid and new variations, even like in terms of making something like biryani, if, here, even like with Muslim second and third generation, some of them are choosing to be vegetarian because, animal rights and things like that. So then you'll see things like tofu biryani, right? That's not necessarily authentic. My grandmother would have never made tofu biryani, in India, but here, if you're using masala from scratch and you're marinating the tofu and you're making the biryani in 2 layers, right? Is it authentic or not, right? And so I'm going to quote Meredith Abarca, who's a Mexican American food scholar, who says, authentic or not, it's original, right? And so even when you have women of color creating new recipes, taking their mother and grandmother's recipes and creating it with new proteins or new variations, can we still see it as authentic? authentic, because I think that that search for authenticity can be really complicated in terms of really if you're going back to India now, even now, right? With everything that's changed in technology, frozen food, access to all kinds of different pre-packaged meals, I would say that it's a complicated in terms of what we think of authentic.
I think when you are talking about authenticity as well, this question about generational changes, and
Yes.
what are we looking at? So, when we are thinking about these Desi Muslim immigrants, do you see their foodways reflecting generational changes?
Yes, I would say yes and no, right? It varies by class also, even for, Muslim Indian immigrants, right? And it also varies even by community, right? In terms of like even where they located regionally, I would say all these things matter because when you get to studying like Desi Muslim immigrants, like somewhere like Chicago, where there's a very large community, right? You can create your own little India, just like there's like a little India, even like in New York City, even in Houston. And so in those communities, right? There is such a large community that the way that they can pass on recipes and foodways, it's much easier. And then when you're looking at Muslim, Indian, or Pakistani immigrants in like smaller areas. But I do say that what's interesting in some of the research that I did in terms of generation is that second generation Desi Muslim women whose recipes are exactly like their mothers who immigrated here in the 1970s, right? There are some that have like, as soon as they started college or got married, that they actually recorded their mother's recipes. But then there's others who would claim that they've improved their mother's recipes, right? By using only organic, ingredients or using only local ingredients. And so I think where we're seeing the difference, is in location and in class, right? And so sometimes upper class women outsource cleaning, but are still choosing to make the meals from scratch. But then we're seeing middle class women who are maybe working full time and, using a mix of frozen desi food and fresh desi meals. So there's a variation there that's happening with the second generation. What's interesting is I would argue that there's not necessarily a watering down of desi food, right? So, I mean, I'll just use the example of like there's a Gujarati Muslim community in Florida, and many of those women, the mothers immigrated in the 1970s and 1980s. So now their daughters are in their 40s and 50s, and they are, they're able to maintain the Gujarati, Muslim recipes because their mothers are here, their mothers are still alive, they're recording them, and they have, been able to cook with them and learn them. And so they, in many ways, I would say that those second generation Gujarati Muslim women are creating recipes, creating meals and food ways that are just as authentically Gujarati Indian Muslim as their parents were, right? But they might have changed some ingredients, as I said, like this, some of them that are wealthy, cooking organic, cooking local, things like that, growing their own tomatoes, having an organic tomato garden. You might, see some of those distinctions around class.
And since you're talking about Muslim women, and cooking, sort of want to know from you and from your own work, how Muslim immigrant women construct a halal kitchen in the US. I mean,
Yeah. Sure. So the idea of a halal kitchen is, much more symbolic than literal, first of all, right? Because it's not the same as having like a kosher kitchen because there's a lot more rules for Jewish foodways around how they maintain kosher in terms of utensils and dishes and things like that. And we, at least amongst the American Muslim Desi community, there's nothing like that in Islamic law that I've come across. And so it's more symbolic, right? And it refers more to the, avoiding pork and alcohol products, making sure that the kitchen doesn't have any ingredients that would be, perceived as haram, right? So that's, haram, not permissible. And then I would say, so I would say it's twofold. A, the halal kitchen, right, avoids anything that's not permissible. And secondly, I would say halal kitchen can also be understood symbolically in terms of a community space that also is a space where we create what I would call culinary placemaking through helping, facilitate creating meals around Muslim holidays, such as Eid, Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr, right? We're in the middle of Ramadan right now, creating iftars, the breaking of the fast, right? So that's what I would say the halal kitchen is really about. And so in Ramadan, having a halal kitchen would have dates in addition to halal meat. A halal kitchen would be a place where by the time Ramadan's over and we're getting ready for Eid, that we're preparing celebratory food, if it's savaya or gulab jamun and, special treats that, are of course still Indian, but are also associated with holidays.
Um, sort of to finally, we'd like you to talk a little bit about the role that food plays in how intersectionality can be understood. And please do also talk about how religion becomes an important factor in understanding intersectionality among Desi Muslim migrants in the US.
Sure. Well, so of course, I used the theoretical framework of intersectionality in my book in 2021, talking about South Asian Muslim American women in the middle class specifically. And I was drawn to intersectionality because I came to feminist theory through Black feminism, right? So intersectionality being based in the work of Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw. Patricia Hill Collins as, a sociologist of race that I know you all are familiar with. And so when I started looking at doing interviews and studying the second generation specifically, that's what that work is based on, the second generation of South Asian Muslims in Chicago, I realized that I was, primarily focused on the middle class. And so I really wanted to kind of think about how does class intersect with race and gender? But if I'm going to be studying, I actually would argue if you're studying South Asians at all, you should be actually looking at religion, right? So in that book, I argue that religion should be a part of the intersectional framework, especially if you're studying immigrant cultures and if you're studying South Asian women in particular, because even if you're talking to people that are not religious, right? Every Muslim I interviewed was not religious, right? It still plays a part of their ancestry or where they came from, or even like historically in terms of thinking about how immigrant groups in the United States settled. When Indian and Pakistani immigrants started immigrating in larger numbers after 1965, we did see these clusters across the United States and communities forming, where we started seeing mosques were created, temples were created by, Hindu immigrants. And so for us to have these studies now, specifically feminist scholars and sociologists, I would say, and not have religion part of that framework, I think we're overlooking an important factor that really adds a complexity to thinking about South Asian immigrant women, which is what I'm really interested in, right? So that's how it became an important factor to me. I was like, how can I do these interviews and not ask about religion and only focus on race, class, and gender, when religion is such an important part of identity for many Muslim South Asian women? Even if they're not religious, they still talk about religion. And, even the ones who consider themselves, maybe more secular, they talk about how they culturally still practice things like Eid, even if they're not fasting. And so I want to say that just like in places like India and Pakistan, there's such diversity amongst what it means to be a Muslim woman. Even in the US, there are non-practicing Muslim women in the South Asian diaspora as well as practicing, and there's a continuum. But religion does, still, I think I argue, is still an important aspect of understanding the social factors that, shape community and identity, So I went, a little bit broader than thinking about just food, but in terms of food, of course, when I was doing that work in finished that work in 2020, and the book came out in 2021. And even with the work I'm doing now, because I'm looking at first generation Indian and Pakistani Muslim women in Florida. Religion is still really important in terms of food, So when we're thinking about food, we're thinking about what kind of food do you maintain and how do you maintain it, right? And this idea that like food is not just about being Indian or Pakistani, it's also about region, it's about religion, it's about, class and gender are also reflected there. And so I think it's really important to understand that. But the second point I want to make about intersectionality, however, is that my work in 2021 just started looking at how for me, when I'm studying South Asian women or Muslim South Asian women in particular, I think it's really important that we use intersectionality in conversation with transnational feminism, because I think one of the blind spots, even in my own work, even though I was studying Muslim immigrants, was like not looking at things like caste and colonialism closely enough. And since 2021, I've been looking more and more at how can we use intersectionality in conversation with transnational feminism and address like the histories of, colonialism, post-colonialism, and think about colonialism and caste with religion, race, class, and gender as well. And so I think all of those things give us a more full and deeper understanding of trying to, explore how we, as sociologists and feminist scholars, can understand the lives and communities of South Asian women and Muslim American South Asian women in particular. And then for me, lastly, right, after 9/11, and then again since COVID, right, we think about how religion has had like, I would say, an increased importance in the lives of many Muslim immigrants, not just in the US, right, but globally, right? So this is why I make that caveat that even some of the Muslim immigrants that would not consider themselves, very religious, right? Maybe just culturally Muslim, right? But we see how being Muslim also becomes politicized, and of course, I don't have to tell you all this because you're in India, and so even thinking about those connections between the U.S. and India and the Middle East, right? And so I think for me, even when I don't ask about, religion, when I'm interviewing or doing ethnography in an immigrant Muslim community, religion comes up, right? And then it intersects with class as well as generation. And then, of course, I don't want to not acknowledge the differences in Sunni and Shia Muslims when I'm talking about religion, because the population I study is not just South Asian Muslim Americans. I'm focusing on Sunni South Asian Muslim American women.
Right. Actually, we did say finally, but I wanted to have, some more detailed response to this question about your fieldwork experience, your positionality, because it's also interesting to look at you as a researcher and the field that you are, researching. And, how did being a Muslim woman also impact the research that you're doing? Because, food is also something very personal, it's material. So how did you sort of, navigate the field?
So I feel like I've changed since I did it. So the book that came out in 2021 was, based on second generation middle class Desi Muslim women in Chicago. And now I'm doing research with the first generation. So these are Indian Muslim women, and their ages are between 70 and 85 in Florida. And one of the ways I've changed is, I've really moved from thinking of myself as a sociologist to a feminist scholar. And so thinking more about feminist praxis. So specifically thinking more about positionality and also care, and thinking about how do I approach my research with care. And, in terms of care, and both in terms of like, what does it mean to be studying your own community? What does it mean not to be creating harm, right? Because I'm thinking more and more about my own privilege as a researcher and this assumption, like in the United States, right, by the 1980s, Indian immigrants were considered the model minority because we didn't have a history of creating, political problems. And there was all the, there were so many that immigrated by 65, between 65 and 80, that were economically upwardly mobile, right? They were coming as engineers and physicians. And so I think about that, even in terms of positionality, when I'm working with the community and acknowledging now when you go into an Indian community or a Muslim community, there's a lot of class variation. And so when I'm doing this field work now in Tampa, I think about it not as I'm studying a community, but I'm trying to create knowledge with the community, right? So I'm trying to actually build an archive with that community for them, not just go in, because I feel like you can be extractive, right? As a qualitative ethnographer, and I'm really mindful of that. And I really tried to evolve the way I think about creating knowledge and this idea of co-creating knowledge with the people in your community, because now and just being conscious conscious of that. Like, I'm privileged to be a tenured professor. I'm privileged to be a US citizen. And I go into spaces where not everyone is a citizen, not everybody has a college degree. And what does that mean? And how can I be more thoughtful in my care work? Because I am only working now with only creating knowledge with other Muslim women, so I don't really face any discrimination or prejudice in that space, right? When I was doing research in Chicago, I actually, when I was looking at larger populations. I mean, the book was only about Muslim women, but I had done interviews with Catholic Indians and Hindu Indians when I was doing research in Chicago back in graduate school. And so that was very different than now. I'm like literally researching the community that I was raised in. And so I just think when you are doing that kind of research, and ethics of care, and thinking about community work, very differently, and being much more, just reflective of my positionality kind of in every step of the way, right? And not taking it for granted, and also being grateful that even though I know have known a lot of these Muslim Indian women for many decades, that they are letting me into their, a window into their kitchen, honestly, right? And they're giving me a chance to, really share their voices with a larger population. And so that, that's where I am now. I mean, if anything, one of the smallest challenges I have probably is because I am second generation, and all these women have been in the United States now for at least 30 years. So English is not an issue, but every now and then, when they are talking about ingredients and they switch to Urdu or Hindi, I wish my Urdu and Hindi was better. That's what I can say. So when they're talking about tariqa and they're talking about, methods and things like that, and I'm taking notes, I was like, oh, if I had stronger language skills, because I can totally understand Hindi and Urdu, but I feel that that's one place that I could even have gotten even richer. Being able to do conversations in Urdu and Hindi with them rather than not making them, but having them talk in English, right? That's also like as in terms of my positionality, I'm having them cater to me, right? Many of them probably would love it if I was as good in Hindi and Urdu as they are, and I could do these conversations and interviews in their first language rather than their second language.
I think that's a very interesting point that you mentioned about language, in terms of, the positionality and the reflexivity. And thank you so much, Farha, for speaking to the two of us. This has been a very fun interview, and
Oh,
we
good.
have actually enjoyed listening to you. And thank you once again for doing this, for doing sociology.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.